to our top story. President Trump is set to deliver an address to the nation tonight for what the White House says will be a, quote, important update on Iran. This comes as the president yesterday provided a new timeline for when the United States military offensive there may wind down. Speaking to reporters in the Oval Office, President Trump said U.S. forces could leave Iran in 2 or 3 weeks, with or without a deal. He once again insisted, without providing details, that regime change has been achieved. He also claimed he attained his goal of dealing with Iran's nuclear program. And the president again lashed out at U.S. allies, shifting responsibility to them to deal with the now closed Strait of Hormuz.
I think that the people understand it. We'll be leaving very soon. And if France or some other country wants to get oil or gas, they'll go up through the Strait and Hormuz Strait. They'll go right up there and they'll be able to fend for themselves. Look, problem with the Strait, a guy can take a mine, drop it in the water, and say, oh, it's unsafe. It's not like you're taking out an army or you're taking out a country or they can drop it. Or you can take a machine gun from the shore and shoot a few bullets at a ship. Or maybe an over-the-shoulder missile, small missiles. That's not for us. That'll be for France. That'll be for whoever's using the Strait. But I think when we leave, probably that's all cleared up.
You know, David Ignatius.
No, I don't think so.
You know, David, it's so hard to tell exactly what's going on, and that's the way the president wants it. A lot of misdirection. Trying to figure out, is he really, I mean, are we really talking about 2 to 3 weeks? Is the president trying to soothe the markets? Is the president trying to get Iran to drop its defenses? The United States continues moving assets to the region that would suggest a ground invasion is coming. There's no reason to move some of the forces there. That have been moved there unless we expect a ground invasion. So I'm not saying that's going to happen. I'm just saying anybody that's listening to what the president says in the White House would be instructed to go back and see what he was saying the Friday before the attack the following weekend. What do you make of all of it?
So we'll see tonight, Joe, how the president puts it together. But based on what we're looking at, we're seeing a combination of continuing military force, continuing operations in Iran to take out the remaining targets, and a kind of diplomacy. President Trump keeps talking about direct negotiations with Iran, but there's no evidence that they're really direct in any sense other than directly handing people messages through intermediaries. What was striking about his comments yesterday was it was close to declaring victory. I've won. We've achieved regime change. We've achieved our nuclear goals. Both of those claims are pretty suspect. But I think most important, saying we don't require a deal at a negotiating table, and basically we're going to leave to others the question of reopening the Strait of Hormuz. That's the part that's really, I think, going to be difficult for President Trump and the rest of the world. The rest of the world does need to step up and take responsibility. But the idea that that's for you to worry about, that the United States started a war that led to the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, and then we walk away and say, that's your problem, France and China, not ours. That will rub people the wrong way. Suzanne Maloney, a senior person at the Brookings Institution, Mika, described that as unbelievably irresponsible, that walking away from the Strait of Hormuz, leaving it closed. And I think a lot of other people will react that way. But the stock markets, financial markets, obviously are delighted at the thought that this war, which was getting more and more painful for the world economy, may be ending. And there'll be a lot of people around the world, for understandable reasons, will be happy to see an end of hostilities. As I think, Joe and Mika, about the question we always ask, what does the day after look like? The day after looks like revolutionary, hardline figures in charge in Iran, and no success by the United States in really deflecting the course of that regime. The regime will still assert control of the Strait of Hormuz, so it'll be at very best an ambiguous ending to this very painful conflict.
Well, many people would also suggest, David, that if they control the straits after the war, which they didn't control before the war, that it'll actually be a victory for Iran. Again, not militarily, but geopolitically and economically. You know, I love to get your response to what Alex Younger told The Economist, of course, the longest-serving MI6 chief. He said, Iran's in a civilizational war, a war of existence. We're in a war of choice. And just you could also apply that to Ukraine versus Russia. Does that not explain, in part, why Iran has planned ahead, spread out their assets, understood this day was coming, and was more prepared for it, more resilient than most Western analysts thought?
I think that's one of the takeaways of the war for me, is that Iran planned better, dispersed its forces better, survived our best shot better. Let's not forget that President Trump thought, not entirely without reason, that he'd come in and give him a real punch in the nose in the first days of this war, heavy bombardment, and that they'd capitulate. That's what he'd seen in Venezuela. That's what his life experience tells him happens. And in this case, it didn't. And the Iranians held tough. The ones who survived are going to be tougher, more hardline. You take a look at the person who President Trump seems to be designated as the new regime, the Speaker of Parliament, Mohammad Bakr Kalibaf. This is a man who joined the Revolutionary Guard at 18. He's really never known anything but the IRGC and its toughness, its resistance. So the idea that this is a bright new future with reformers, which was some of what the president was suggesting yesterday, that just doesn't fit reality.
So, John, we can obviously view this new 2-week timeline with great skepticism. He always says it's 2 weeks. He said that last week and the week before, and they said maybe a couple more days or maybe another week. So kind of put that to the side. But what he declared yesterday, as David said, that regime change has been achieved. Remember, he said that the morning after the invasion, regime change. We're going to get these people out. Clearly, there has not been regime change, just slightly different people on the top. That the nuclear program has been set back 15 or 20 years. That's a new announcement from the President of the United States. I think he did declare it had been obliterated last June, so maybe it happened then. And then this idea of walking away with no deal as well and saying, look, Europe, it's up to you. We kind of crippled their military a little bit. We took away their ability to strike at you, perhaps, although they're still doing it, obviously, as Iran. And saying the Strait of Hormuz, maybe we didn't calculate that well, but we're leaving in place for Iran that weapon of theirs, which now they have seen how powerful it is, that if they can shut that down, they can control a lot around the world.
So first of all, our friends at Axios yesterday noted that since this war began a month ago, President Trump 12 different times has said, oh, it's about to end. 12 times. Yeah. That he's offered shifting timelines. He's declared victory several times already. And then, of course, the war continues. And, you know, the White House is playing close to the vest. What we'll hear from the president tonight, 9 o'clock, the networks have given him time to address the nation. Some of this is aides around him have said, one thing you did poorly, they didn't sell the war to begin with, right? They didn't make the case to the American people or to our allies. So maybe retroactively, this is his attempt to explain to the U.S. why we did this. It's also possible that he'll announce the beginning of some sort of withdrawal, some sort of escalation, or even both. Because as David Ignatius has been writing, he's been doing that, where he's sort of climbing down at the same time ramping up the strikes. And let's be clear, even as he's saying this war's about to be over, more military assets are arriving in the region as we speak. They are in place. And for the first time, if he were to give the okay for a ground operation, whether it be to Karg Island or perhaps to try to find the uranium, now the assets are in place to do so. So this isn't about talk anymore. He could give the green light to make this happen. And Caddy, that, of course, would be a market escalation. And I think that, you know, there are people in Trump's orbit, in his inner circle, and certainly in the political operations who think this would be a terrible idea, that the American people do not want to see boots on the ground. That said, if we leave and the Strait of Hormuz is still closed, let's be clear, that is a defeat for the United States. We've lost. And the economic pressure that is behind Trump wanting to ramp this war down, well, that pressure would persist. So a lot of this simply isn't adding up.
Yeah, I mean, the president will obviously try to paint it as a win. He'll say we've decimated their missile production capacity, which is true, that really has been damaged, and that Iran is weaker than it was before February the 28th when America went in. But I think I've been trying to reach out to economists and oil experts and people around the world and in the UAE to find out what would happen if America pulled out. And it's pretty unclear. I mean, it would seem that Iran would be left with this ability to charge a toll, which would have some impact on the price of oil for consumers around the world, but not very much. It would be a cent on the gallon or something like that. But they would have the ability to have an to have an on and off switch and an ability to reshut the straits if they wanted to. And they still have the ability to strike their neighbors and key energy facilities in the Persian Gulf. And that's, something that they would want to do if they felt they were going to be attacked again in 6 months' time as they started to rebuild their missile supplies. All of that very unsettling to the UAE, which now says that they want to make sure that actually this job gets finished. And it's why you have the Wall Street Journal this morning in their editorial board saying having started this, it's too dangerous to leave the Straits. It's too dangerous to the world economy. We've realized that oil is traded on a global basis. That's why American consumers are feeling it. As Asian countries are starting to reduce their production and scale back because of the energy costs, that is something that's going to be felt by American consumers too. So there has to be some kind of global solution to the Straits. It can't be left to the whim of the Iranians opening and shutting it every time they feel under threat.
Right, and you bring up such a great point, and I wish people would just stop showing their ignorance by saying, oh, the United States doesn't need oil from the rest of the world, drill, baby, drill, as if that's going to take care of the fact that oil is traded on a global market. So it doesn't matter how much we drill here. If the straits are closed, people are going to be paying $4 per gallon. And it's going to be extraordinarily difficult. So we'll see what happens there. Willie, though, I will say if the president were to leave in 2 to 3 weeks, it seems there may be two big takeaways for the president. One, he'll say mission accomplished because, well, Iran's military has been degraded a great deal. But number two, he will leave with yet another excuse and he's been building. He's been setting up straw men against NATO and knocking them down now for about a decade. He will come up with another built-in excuse to get rid of the alliance that Vladimir Putin fears the most, NATO.
Yeah,